Ever like swap baseball cards as a kid? Or maybe you bargain for like extra dessert for doing chores. I mean, really, that's kind of like a contract, right?
Totally.
It's interesting how these like formal legal things we call contracts, they actually kind of stem from these like everyday deals we make, you know?
Yeah, for sure. We don't always think about it, but like the whole offer acceptance consideration thing, all that's built into how we interact all the time.
It's true. We're constantly making these little agreements without even realizing it. And speaking of agreements, you sent me some super interesting stuff about contract law. It seems like we're really going deep on common law and this whole uniform commercial code thing.
Yeah, the UCC.
Where do we even begin with all this?
Well, that first source you sent, it really lays the groundwork. Like, what exactly is a contract and where do all these rules come from? And why should we even care? The basics.
Okay, so let's break it down. First things first, define contract. But like in plain English, no legal jargon.
Okay, so basically it's a promise, but like a really serious promise. So serious that the law will actually step in to make sure you keep it. It's like an agreement, but with consequences if you back out?
Gotcha. So that whole legally binding thing I hear people say, but where do these laws even come from? I see this source mentions two big ones, common law and the Uniform Commercial Code,
Right,
or UCC for short.
right.
What's the deal with those?
So imagine common law like this giant collection of court decisions over like centuries. It's almost like a big game of telephone where each ruling kind of builds on the ones that came before it.
So it's always evolving based on how judges have interpreted things in the past.
Exactly. Now, to make sense of all that, we have the restatement. Think of it as a cheat sheet for contract law. I mean, it's not the law itself, but it carries a lot of weight in guiding how courts interpret all those messy common law principles.
Okay, so like Cliff's Notes for lawyers.
Yeah.
But then there's this whole other system, the UCC. What's up with that?
See, the UCC is super interesting because it focuses specifically on contracts about selling goods, basically tangible stuff that we buy and sell. Cars, furniture, phones, things you can actually touch.
So instead of that long history of court decisions, the UCC is like, here are the rules for buying and selling this stuff. Why even have a separate system for that?
Well, the business world moves fast. The UCC gets that. So it's all about being flexible and efficient. Like, unlike common law, which is pretty strict, with the UCC, you can often tweak or even waive parts of it if both sides agree.
So it's less about rigid rules and more about what makes sense for a specific deal.
Right. But, and this is important, even with that flexibility, the UCC is super clear about one thing. You got to act in good faith. You can't just like negotiate your way out of being honest and fair.
Yeah, like an underlying code of conduct, even when you're like haggling over the price or whatever. But hold on, what happens when a contract involves both, like physical goods and services?
Hmm.
Like, what if I'm buying a new camera, right? But I'm also paying extra for them to like set it up. Which rules went out then?
Oh, good question. That's where things get interesting. We use something called the substantial purpose doctrine. Essentially, we got to figure out the main point of the contract. What's its primary purpose? So in that camera example, if the setup cost is like way less than the camera itself, it's probably still under the UCC because the heart of the deal is that tangible camera.
So it's like a balancing act to see what carries more weight, legally speaking.
Exactly.
That makes sense. But even with all these little details, I got to ask, why should I even care about contracts? I mean, I'm not a lawyer or some big business person. This seems like, I don't know, a little niche, you know?
Well, because contracts are way more than just these dry legal documents. They're actually super important for like a functioning society.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more.
For starters, contracts really keep the economy humming along. Think about it. Would you ever take the risk of like starting a business, inventing something new, or even just selling stuff online if there was no guarantee that the other person would actually hold up their end of the deal?
That's a good point. That element of trust is pretty essential if you want people to actually do business, big or small.
Exactly. And contracts provide that framework of trust. Like your source uses this simple example. Say you pay a friend to mow your lawn, right? You're relying on them to actually show up and do it, and they're relying on you to actually pay them as agreed.
Right.
Contracts provide that accountability. They make sure both sides follow through.
It's true. Without those guarantees, it'd be like way too risky.
Exactly. Nobody wants to do business in a world where Anyone can just back out of a deal without any consequences.
Exactly. So we've got these agreements, these contracts holding everything together.
Right. And it goes way beyond those everyday transactions, too. Like, think about massive economic activities like investments, loans, even international trade.
Wow. Yeah.
Those all depend on this idea of enforceable agreements.
So contracts are like the bedrock of the whole system.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But it's more than just the economy, believe it or not. Contracts also protect something else that's super important: your autonomy.
Okay, now break that down for me. What does autonomy have to do with contracts?
It's all about your freedom to make your own choices, to structure your own agreements. Contracts give you the power to say, like, this is what I'm willing to agree to, but only under these specific terms. Without that legal backing, you're basically at the mercy of someone else's interpretation of what you agreed to, which can get messy fast.
Totally. It's like with a contract, you've got a clear roadmap instead of just vague directions. Everyone knows what they're getting into.
Exactly. And because those agreements are legally binding, it paves the way for these big, ambitious collaborations. Think about developing like a new technology.
Right.
It takes tons of trust and coordination between, the inventors, investors, manufacturers. Contracts provide that solid foundation that makes those kinds of partnerships even possible.
That makes sense. But what about those situations where, like, one person tries to take advantage of the other? How do contracts prevent that?
That's where this idea of unjust enrichment comes in. Remember that story a while back about that musician who helped write a hit song but never got paid?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Totally. That's a classic example of how not having a contract can lead to someone unfairly profiting off someone else's work. Contracts protect against that by making sure everyone involved gets their fair share. It's all about fairness.
Right, so contracts aren't just about protecting yourself. They're about making sure other people are treated fairly, too.
Absolutely. And, that actually ties into another major benefit of contracts. They protect reliance.
Reliance. Okay, remind me what that means again.
Basically, it means you're taking some kind of action based on a promise someone made, often putting yourself on the line in the process. Imagine you're a small business owner, right? You hire a contractor to renovate your shop. They promise to be done by a certain date, so you're relying on them to keep their word. I mean, your entire livelihood could depend on them reopening on time. Contracts protect that reliance by giving you legal options if they don't hold up their end of the bargain.
It's like a safety net, especially when you're making big decisions with serious consequences.
Exactly. And that's where the true power of contracts lies, I think. They establish this system of accountability and recourse, which in the end encourages everyone to collaborate and innovate.
Okay, so we've covered some serious ground here. We talked about how contracts provide a framework for economic activity. We talked about how to protect individual autonomy and prevent exploitation. It's like you're revealing this whole hidden structure behind how society functions.
It's true, it's all connected. And what's really cool is that we've only just scratched the surface. Within these broad principles of contract law, there are tons of nuances and specific rules. Like, remember how we were discussing the flexibility of the UCC compared to common law?
Yeah, that was really interesting. I'm starting to realize there's a lot more to this contract law stuff than I initially thought.
Oh, definitely. Let's look at a specific example. One area where the UCC differs big time from common law is in how it deals with what's called battle of the forms. You see, with common law, if the terms in an acceptance don't perfectly match the offer, it's not actually considered an acceptance, it's a counteroffer.
Mm-hmm.
And that can cause a lot of confusion and delays, especially when you've got businesses sending forms back and forth with, like, minor differences.
Yeah, that sounds like a recipe for disaster, especially in today's fast-paced business world.
Tell me about it. So the UCC steps in with a more practical approach. Under UCC Section 2207, a contract can actually be formed even if the acceptance has different or extra terms than the original offer. It's meant to keep things moving, so businesses aren't getting bogged down by small discrepancies.
So the UCC is like, let's make this deal happen, even if there's some minor differences on paper.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions and limitations to that rule, but the main takeaway is that the UCC gets the realities of business, right? It knows things aren't always so black and white, so it offers more flexibility than those traditional common law ideas.
That's fascinating. I can see how knowing all these little details about the UCC would be super valuable for anyone, like buying or selling goods.
Totally. And it just goes to show how important it is to have some legal expertise, to navigate these complexities and protect yourself.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, how contracts are good for society,
Mm-hmm.
economic efficiency, autonomy, fairness, hmm, more. We've even gotten into the weeds a bit with the Uniform Commercial Code, but let's bring it back down to earth for a sec. How do all these legal concepts actually play out in, like, real life?
Love that question. And it brings us back to why you should care about this stuff, even if you're not a lawyer or a CEO.
Because, let's be honest, most of us aren't drafting up complex contracts every way.
Exactly. But we are entering into agreements constantly, often without even thinking about it. Like, think about the last time you booked a flight online, ordered takeout through an app,
Right?
even just agreeing to meet a friend for coffee. All of those are basically implicit contracts. They have a set of expectations and obligations. And while most of the time those agreements work out fine, knowing even a little bit about contract law can really help you in those situations where things go sideways.
It's like having that little bit of knowledge can actually give you more control in those day-to-day situations.
Exactly. It helps you understand, like, what are my rights here,
Yeah.
or it can help you negotiate better, or even avoid some nasty surprises down the road.
Right, right.
For example, imagine you're signing a lease, right, for a new apartment,
Uh-huh.
understanding some of the key terms in that contract, like what are the termination clauses, or what about security deposit deductions, knowing that stuff can save you a ton of headaches later on.
It's like knowing the rules of the game, right?
Yeah.
Even if it's just a casual game with friends.
Exactly. And the more you learn about these principles, the more you start to see them everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Like, think about all those social movements that are pushing for more corporate accountability, or even just those online platforms that have those super long terms of service agreements.
Right.
Contract law is at the heart of all of that.
It's like we're seeing behind the curtain now this whole other layer of how the world works, you know?
That's what I love about these deep dives. We start with, like, a simple agreement, and we end up talking about the UCC and global commerce. It's crazy how these basic ideas of, like, promises and obligations, they really do shape everything.
You know, I'll be honest, when I first started looking at all this stuff, I was a little intimidated.
Really?
Yeah, but you've done a great job of explaining it all. It's actually, dare I say, a little fun to think about.
Well, I'm glad you think so. That's always my goal, to make this stuff seem less, like, scary and lawyerly and more like something anyone can understand.
You've definitely succeeded. So as we wrap up here, is there one big takeaway, one last thought you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest thing to remember is this. Contracts aren't about limiting us. They're about giving us the power to shape our world.
Wow, I like that.
It's about more than just rules and regulations.
Right.
It's about using these tools to work together, to create new things, and to build a better, fairer world.
That's a great way to put it. Instead of thinking of contracts as these big, scary documents, we should think of them as tools, just like you said.
Cool.
Tools that help us collaborate and
Yeah.
make cool things happen.
Exactly.
Well, this has been fascinating. We started with some childhood agreements and ended up talking about all sorts of complex legal ideas. It just goes to show there's always more to learn.
Absolutely.
So to our listeners, if you found this interesting, don't stop here. Keep exploring. The world of contract law is full of surprises. And who knows, you might even find it a little bit funny along the way.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of contracts. And remember, whether it's a formal agreement or just a handshake, always keep those agreements honest. We'll see you next time.